Welcome to Chapter 2 of Introduction to Psychology. In this lecture, I'll be covering topics from psychological research, particularly what the different approaches to conducting scientific research in psychology are, and as well as how to interpret findings from psychological research, focusing on chapters 2.2 and 2.3 from the OpenStax textbook. Many of you have likely heard of power posing, which is the notion that by adopting a strong or powerful or broad physical stance, you can induce certain changes, certain physiological changes that help you feel more assertive or more dominant or more effective in certain social situations or before taking on a big task. This finding was most widely published by this researcher by the name of Amy Cuddy, who has the second most popular TED Talk out there with over 57 million views, covering this really astounding notion that how your body language can really help you feel more effective and help your body actually prepare to take on more difficult tasks. And so when I asked the 26 students in this class who responded to the survey, 88% said that this effect was real, that this was a real psychological phenomenon. The truth is a little bit more mixed. Most psychologists would probably say that this effect is not real, that it's false, or at least mostly false, or at least that we don't have enough evidence to say that it's true. And so today we'll be discussing briefly using this as an example of why the scientific method is so important in psychology and how oftentimes really interesting findings can be refuted by later findings. So the original power posing study was published in 2010 by these researchers at Columbia University and Harvard University. And in their study, they had 42 participants who were instructed to hold two power poses for a total of 2 minutes. So they would hold each power pose for 1 minute each, one right after the other. And so the 42 participants were divided up into two groups, a high power pose group and a low power pose group. So individuals in the high power pose group they were instructed and taught how to adopt some stances that were physically strong or took up more space, and the low power pose group were instructed to adopt stances that were smaller or more constricted. And then after this 2 minute period of holding these power posing stances, the participants all completed a simulated gambling task where they were rewarded with money for making risky bets. And they also completed a questionnaire asking them to rate how confident they felt in the moment. In addition to that, they also took saliva samples both before and after the power posing period so that they could measure testosterone and cortisol. So for those who aren't familiar, cortisol is often referred to as the stress hormone. It's a hormone that's released when your body or even just your mind is facing some kind of threat or some kind of stressful situation. And testosterone in this study, they conceptualized it as the hormone that signals feelings of dominance in a particular situation. So here are some examples of the four poses that were included in this study. So over on the left, you have the two high power poses that were included in the study, and on the right, the two low power poses included in the study. And participants were videotaped to make sure that they held the positions correctly for a total period of 2 minutes. So, what the researchers in the original study found was that very interestingly, the individuals in the high power group showed significant increases in testosterone levels in comparison to their levels before adopting the power poses, as well as significant decreases in cortisol, so less stress after adopting a high power pose. And then conversely, individuals in the low power group kind of showed the opposite. They showed decreases in testosterone after adopting a low power pose, and then increases in cortisol or increases in stress, physiological stress anyway, after adopting a low power pose. And not shown here is that the participants in the high power pose also showed more risky behavior on the gambling task. They were more comfortable on average making risky bets on the gambling task, and also reported greater feelings of confidence on average than individuals in the low power group. So these findings were very, very promising. And the authors concluded that power posing goes beyond just making people feel more confident and actually results in real behavioral changes. It actually makes people take more risks and be more assertive in their decision making, as well as, most interestingly, it results in hormonal changes. Adopting a high power pose results in lower stress and greater testosterone production, greater dominance. And so this was a very, very exciting finding because it suggested that people could essentially change their lives, change their behavior, change how they interact with people just by adopting a 2-minute pose. It seemed like just a perfect life hack. But several follow-up studies were published, including this one in 2015, that really disputed those early findings. So this study in 2015 had a larger sample, about 200 people, in comparison to just 42 people in the original study, and used a very similar procedure. And what they found was that for people in the high power pose group, those individuals did show greater self-reported feelings of confidence than the low power group, but all the other differences that the original study found were not replicated. People in the high power posing group did not show any difference in risky behavior on a gambling task in comparison to the low power group, nor were they significantly different from the low power posing group in their testosterone or cortisol level. So they concluded that the effect of power posing was limited to subjective feelings, but there were no notable physiological effects. That power posing can make you feel more confident, but it doesn't change how your body's physiology, and how that contributes to underlying notions of dominance or stress response. They pointed out a key methodological problem in the first study, which was that participants in the first study were rewarded for taking risks in the gambling task. They were given money for certain gambling decisions that they made, and that they hypothesized that maybe that might have influenced their hormonal responses in one way or another. And so the authors or Dr. Cuddy responded and offered a counter to the points of this 2015 study, kind of saying that the main finding was always that power posing helps people feel more confident subjectively, and that the hormonal changes were just kind of a bonus finding. Also, the 2015 study had people hold their poses for a total of 6 minutes, and Dr. Cuddy hypothesized that maybe more isn't better. Maybe holding, a power pose for 6 minutes is too long. Maybe it's just awkward and doesn't result in the real effects. So there's lots of dispute still raging on in the power posing research, but the current scientific consensus from many studies is that yes, perhaps power posing can help you feel more confident, but it does not appear to change your body's physiology in any underlying way. So is power posing useful? Maybe, but it might just be all in your head. It doesn't cause any kind of physiological change. So while it's true that we do communicate important messages to other people through our body language, it's not true. There's not enough evidence to suggest that our body language results in any changes in hormonal levels, or just by adopting a simple stance for 2 minutes can have real physiological effects on how we function. And so this was a really great example of how the scientific method can can really evolve how we think about early findings in research or prominent findings. Dr. Cuddy went on to publish a book on her findings, and as we mentioned earlier, had a hugely successful TED Talk, but a lot of but also faced a lot of harsh criticism and likely sexist criticism from other psychologists because of the methodological problems and how later studies didn't support her original findings. She quietly left her position at Harvard Business School due to the mounting pressure, and I really think just as interesting as the findings in her original study, it was the reaction to the later studies that contradicted her research. There was such a huge backlash in the social psychology field, and this is often used as an example of what's called the replication crisis in psychology. That many cool and interesting findings that get published on BuzzFeed or on social media and on TED Talks don't often get replicated by later studies. And so now Dr. Cuddy is publishing research. She has lots of other really interesting research. She's publishing research on bullying in adulthood and chronicling her experiences of being on the receiving end of really harsh feedback when she had to change her position on her original studies.